Hello, this is Sam Mihara. I am a former prisoner at the Heart Mountain, Wyoming prison camp for Japanese during World War II. This is a short story about what happened, why it happened, and the lessons learned in that process. So this is a story about why only Japanese were removed from the West Coast and not Germans and Italians during World War II. Then I describe the important events that happened when I went to the camp, how we were treated, what our living conditions were, and what the specific impact was on my family. And then I conclude with the lessons learned in this process. After Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, life became extremely difficult for people of Japanese ancestry. We found these types of political cartoons that expresses the sentiment of the media and the people. This cartoon shows an Asian Japanese soldier with a bloodied knife and a German Nazi soldier with his weapon, and they're both encroaching upon the continental US. The caption reads, "Our homes are in danger now." That implies that it's the people of Japanese and German ancestry who are living in this country who are the real danger. President Roosevelt made several good decisions, but he made one very bad decision. He listened to his advisors who recommended that the president sign an executive order. That executive order simply states that he is giving the authority to remove anyone. He's giving that authority to the local military commanders. He does not name Japanese, he doesn't name German or Italians, simply the authority to remove people. So he signed that on February 19th, called the Executive Order 9066, a very important document. So who are the military commanders at that time who have the authority to remove people? They're shown on this next chart, which is the map of the military districts in the United States. And it shows 4 major districts in the US and 1 district in the Pacific. On the right side, you'll see an image of Lieutenant General Hugh Drum. He was in charge of the Eastern Defense Command. And he had a problem. The problem is he cannot, or he has the ability to remove people, but he did not. And the reason is the industry complained. If you remove my German and Italian and a few Japanese workers, I cannot produce. And so the industry leaders convinced him not to do that. So he was not a racist as a result. He simply followed the constituency of most of the industry in the East Coast. Way out in the Pacific, there's a Lieutenant General de Los Emmons. And General Emmons had a problem. That problem is 40% of Hawaii was made up of Japanese. So he considered with his new authority to remove Japanese. However, the local industry complained, especially the pineapple industry. They said, if you remove my workers, I can't produce pineapples. But more importantly, General Emmons recognized that it was unconstitutional to remove any particular race. So as a result, he decided not to. On the other hand, in the western region of the US, there's a Lieutenant General John DeWitt. John DeWitt, it turns out, he had no problem. He was a racist. He hated Japanese. He didn't hate Germans, he didn't hate Italians, but he hated Japanese. So what's the evidence that he had so much hate? Well, as one example, he ordered children who had mixed parents. In other words, they were children of mixed parents, mixed race, and he found them in orphanages, and he ordered these children to a prison, removed from the orphanages. Here's a photograph of the children that were removed and placed into the prison camp at Manzanar, California. Look on the third row carefully. You'll notice these babies being held by guardians. All those espionage agents and saboteurs, without question, they are suspicious and they must be placed into prison. But that's how inhumane and biased that General DeWitt was at that time. So we all got on the trains. The trains came to pick us up, and now the soldiers are shoulder to shoulder, guarding us to make sure we don't escape as we get on board the trains. Entire families being ready to move on to a location. We were not told where to go or where we were going. They simply said, get on the train and you'll learn later. Well, 3 days and nights later, our train wound up in northern Wyoming. Not everyone agreed. In fact, out of 120,000 people, there were 3 courageous Japanese Americans who decided not to go. One of them was Fred Korematsu. Fred had an interesting background. He worked as a welder at a naval shipyard, and he was fired on December the 7th. But he and his girlfriend decided they wanted to stay. And so Fred had plastic surgery to look white, and that's before surgery is on the left and after surgery is on the right. He still looks Japanese. He changed his name. It didn't help because he was caught and he went to prison. The Supreme Court took it up and they decided 6-3, a majority vote, that he should remain in prison. And the primary reason is that Fred Korematsu is capable of espionage. And this country must protect against espionage. Where is Heart Mountain? Well, for those who've been to Yellowstone in Wyoming, you're very close. In fact, the Heart Mountain location is about 50 miles east of Yellowstone. You see the little town of Cody, and that held about 2,000 people. On the right, upper northwest is, northeast is Powell, Wyoming, held about maybe 1,000 people. And Heart Mountain is the name of the mountain, which is halfway between the two towns. In other words, 15 miles away from the town of Cody. And the government decided to build this prison camp in that location in Wyoming. The plan was to build a large facility up to about 30 blocks, uh, and each block had 24 barracks. Each barrack had an average of 25 people. There were plans to build 3 schools. The government decided to build the high school, but they stopped building the 2 elementary schools. And the reason was the local people in the area asked the government, why are you building new schools for prisoners when we who are not in prison don't get new schools? So the government stopped building any more schools beyond the high school. So here's a picture of the mass of people that this is only a small portion of the 10,000 people that were sent to the Heart Mountain camp. Here's a picture of the assembled facilities. I remember this scene when I got there. There's the Heart Mountain in the background. The name Heart Mountain comes from the shape, overall shape of the mountain, which is like a heart. On the left, you see these rows of barracks, some 450 barracks, all identical in design. On the right side, you see the perimeter, the barbed wire fence, and you'll see the guard towers. There's one right here in the foreground. Way on top of the hill, there's another guard tower. There were 9 of them. This slide is the most revealing of all of the security in the facility. On the picture on the left shows the guard with his weapon. He's standing on top of the guard tower with a weapon pointing in toward the barrack. The middle picture shows the details of the guard tower with the floodlights pointing again toward the people inside. But on the right side is the most telltale memory of what happened, and that is signs along the perimeter of the camp. It said, stop, in Japanese and in English. Do not cross this line, or you can be hurt and shot. That defines a prison, that we were held under threat of bodily harm and possibly being killed if we try to cross and escape. The barracks looked like this. There were 6 rooms in each barrack. Each room was a little bit different in size. The one on the ends were the smallest, 16 by 20, and that's for couples or maybe a couple with a small child. The second room is the largest one, 24 by 20, and that held up to 7 people. And the 2 middle rooms are identical. They're 20 by 20, and that's for a family of 4 people. And that's our family. We were in this one room, which is 20 feet by 20 feet. Here's a photograph of the family. This was taken roughly about 1944. That's me in a white shirt, my brother with a sweater. Standing on the left is my mother and her 3 sisters. They're my aunts and an uncle. The photograph was taken immediately in front of our barrack. The toilets were embarrassing. I remember going into the toilet, and this toilet serves 300 people, and there were no partitions. Very, very embarrassing, but we had no choice. The food at the start was really unappetizing. If you'll look closely, you'll notice there's bread on the plate. There's potatoes in the saucer. Inside these large saucer were pickled vegetables. Inside the pitcher was powdered milk. You notice this kid here is not eating. I don't blame him, because that's not the kind of food Japanese ate in 1942. We love rice, we love fresh vegetables, and we like a little bit of poultry for protein. and some eggs and whole milk. So as a result, the farmers in the camp restored or actually converted the desolate countryside, sagebrush covered countryside outside the camp into farms. And by the end of 1 year of very hard work, we were able to eat the kind of food that we were more accustomed to. The first winter was horrible. I remember it got down to minus 28 degrees, and we were forced to walk to all of the facilities. We had to walk to our school in this blizzard, howling winds, 50 miles an hour, horizontal snow and ice hitting your face at minus 28 degrees. It was miserable. We had a hospital, but by name only was it a hospital. All it was a 17 barracks connected with a corridor. And our family had some serious difficulties. I had some problems, but more severe was my father. He had a glaucoma of his eyes before he went to the prison camp, and he was being treated in San Francisco by a specialist who maintained his eyesight. But once we got to Heart Mountain, there was no such skill available. And my father wanted to see his specialist, but General DeWitt would not let him go back to San Francisco, even for a medical exam, and try to take care of his eyes. As a result, my father went blind in camp, never saw again once he entered. The worst case of all was my grandfather. He died in camp. Oh, that's my father learning and reading and studying Braille after he became blind. My grandfather died in camp. We had a funeral for Grandpa, and that's me in a white shirt, my father on my left, on my right, and Grandma with the veil is on my left. I thought something was strange because I watched him as he was going through cancer in a matter of like a couple of months, a very short time. He turned into skin and bones. He lost a lot of weight. He looked like a Holocaust survivor, but in the US. And I thought that was strange. So I looked at his medical records and I found out that they were denying him food. They had given him no intravenous feeding. In fact, they kept his system clean by having him take a laxative for cancer. So that told me a lot about the medical facility. Oh, you can call a building a hospital, but if you don't have the proper staff or you don't have access to the specialists that you need, that was inhumane. Very difficult situation for us. Toward the end of our stay, I remember the government realizing that no one's escaping. In fact, there was not a single escape from Heart Mountain during the 3 years. And as a result, toward the end, the government let a few of us at a time go to downtown Cody and do our shopping. And I remember walking up and down Main Street of Cody, which is called Sheridan Avenue, and looking in each store. And I would explain to my father what was inside the store. You know, here's a pharmacy, here's the restaurant, here's a clothing store, and so forth. About every third store, I saw this sign, no Japs. And that made me wonder. I said, why do they hate us after, we've done nothing to them. We haven't caused them problems. We're trying to bring them some business. And still that hatred existed to make life even more difficult than it need be. Toward the very end, there was a hero attorney. His name is James Purcell, a white attorney who specialized in civil rights. And James Purcell realized that there was something very, very wrong. Because when you take American citizens and place them into a prison without any justice, that's unconstitutional. So he filed a lawsuit against the government on behalf of one lady. Her name is Mitsuo Endo. And the government made some claims, but the case went to the Supreme Court, and they decided unanimous 9-0, that she must be let go, because that was 3 years is a long time, and that's unconstitutional. So as a result, not only did Mitsuo Endo get to go back home, but all of the people who were considered as loyal to the United States were allowed to go home. And that makes up a large percentage of the people in these camps. So we piled on the trains, get ready to go home. And the government decided to eliminate the existence of this camp by selling all 450 barracks to local people, that is, farmers or who else want these, and to move them. The requirement was, if you will move it, you can have the barrack for $1 a piece. So as a result, all the barracks were cleared. Today, if you drive around the area, northern Wyoming, southern Montana, the chances are you'll come across a building that is exactly 20 feet wide and either 120 feet long or 60 feet long, cut in half. And most likely it was a former barrack. So we at the Heart Mountain Foundation are in the process of trying to restore the camp by bringing these barracks back. When we got home, life became very, very difficult. The hatred against Japanese was even worse than when we left. And we were greeted by these kinds of signs: don't stop and come back home, keep moving. So that is a perfect example of racial hatred continuing to build, this hysteria continuing to build throughout. I remember going to the storage facility that held our stored goods, and it looked like this. Our boxes of stored items were vandalized, they're ruined, missing. We lost a lot of valuables in this process. What we wanted after all of this was over was very simple. We wanted an apology from the government for what they did. And we also wanted a small compensation for the damages that took place. It took a long time, 50 years of effort by a large team of pro bono attorneys, that is, attorneys who work without fee, to try to get the government to apologize. One of the steps in that process was an exhibit at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And on the outside, it showed the conditions, photograph of a young children who were loyal, expressing their loyalty. But inside, there are photographs of the entire families who were inside these prisons. And there were also photographs of Japanese American soldiers who fought for this country. Here is a photograph that shows the Sergeant Kaz Masuda in uniform, who came to say goodbye to his entire family. So this picture was taken inside the prison camp. And as a result, that was sent to the White House, and President Reagan was convinced now is the time to sign the bill. So that bill specified an apology and a compensation be provided to those who were in the camp. Here's a letter that I received from the first President George Bush with the key word, sincere apology. Very, very helpful. And along with this letter, there was a small check that helped pay for the damages. Heart Mountain today is not much different. It's a beautiful mountain. But those of us who went through the experience wanted to make sure that people will remember what really happened. So what we did was we built a school. It's called a learning center. And on the outside, it looks like a barrack. It's 20 feet wide, 120 feet long. On the inside, there's a series of walk-through schoolrooms. And as you go through, you'll learn what really happened in much more detail than I'm talking about today. And this is open all year round. We see visitors all year round. One of our most popular visitors is school children. Here's a group that came in for a day and they learned what happened. And it's a day trip for them. And it's a very, very useful function. So I'm sure that these young people will never forget what happened at this lonely place in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. I want to conclude with a point. Why do these camps exist? Well, I told you there were three reasons. The first was racial prejudice. That was clear with the political images of the hatred, especially that happened during the early 1942 period. There was mass hysteria. By that, I mean the media, these political cartoons and other signs, getting all the local people excited and worried about this problem of people of Japanese ancestry in our midst. But most important, there were a few leaders of this country who failed to honor our constitutional rights. Very, very difficult problem because some leaders didn't believe in the Constitution. When I give talks all over the country, a few people, not many, but a few people thinks it's still okay to imprison without justice. They think it's good. And I simply point out to them that it is not good, not for anyone. Remember this photograph. Instead of Japanese, at one time it was almost German and Italian families. Today, it might be Middle Eastern Americans. It might be Muslim Americans. Tomorrow, it could be others. This might be your child looking at the armed guard, wondering, where is he taking me? This might be your daughter inside a prison camp after 3 years, wondering, when am I going to get out? And this might be your son trying to climb out of the prison camp, not knowing there's a guard with a weapon pointing straight at him. And so I simply say, never again to anyone at all, never again. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate your time. I have a book available on my website, www.sammihara. And also I'm available for speaking in more detail. I'd be happy to do that. Thank you very much.
I'm Takashi Hoshizaki, Los Angeles native. On December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. I was 16 years old and not knowing much about what was really happening worldwide. That day, when our family gathered and sat together, trying to figure out what was going on, I was quite surprised to hear my dad saying that Japan is going to lose the war. And we as kids were sort of staring back in complete disbelief. But yet, I was later on, we find, yeah, my dad was correct. So there's a lot of things that he knew that gave him a lot of information as to what was happening. But then uh, in our neighborhood, the people were now, later on in a few weeks, were now forced to then to move out. We did not know where we were going. And so they were now selling things like their cars, ice boxes, and their furniture. And so, but my dad turned around and actually then leased the house that we were living in for 3 years. And again, I wonder how he figured out 3 years would be a good lease time. With all of this going on in the neighborhood, one of the things that it's, I guess, in a way, history is sort of repeating itself today because with the occurrence of Pearl Harbor, many of the people who worked for the government and different uh, businesses were suddenly lost their job. They had no income. And that was true for the other people who were in our neighborhood were gardeners. And so they in turn now, in a way, lost their income. And so today, with this coronavirus lockdown, again, people are faced with loss of income. And I think that the people who are now without jobs can sort of feel this, what the impact was on our Japanese American society right after Pearl Harbor. Then I'm going to then jump ahead, and then and when we ended up in Pomona Assembly Center, I was I would then be standing around and talking with the older Niseis, and one of the things that they kept bringing up was that we should have resisted. We shouldn't have gone along with what the government had said, asked for. I began to wonder what what was really going on. As thinking back to our neighborhood, as when we had to then leave, people then had to sell whatever they had, or even just left many of the prized possessions. Began to think that, well, this whole uh, action of putting us into the camp was wrong. I then wrote of a bitter, complaining letter to my homeroom teacher, telling what how I had felt. And later she wrote back and said she was sorry that I felt that way. But in thinking back, I guess this is sort of the seed of the for my reaction to resist the draft that came much later. Our family ended up in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and in the um, winter of 1943-44, the Army decided that they would draft us out of the camps, and I had we had to register for the draft, and that was for any of the men who were 17 years and older. Draft board then sent back my classification, and it came back as 4C, which then was at that time the enemy alien classification. And so I said, well, that's kind of a strange way of putting it. But then as time went on, um, they then changed the classification to back to 1A, which then meant that I was considered as an American citizen and therefore eligible uh, to be for the draft. All during this time in in 1943, 44, there were groups, different people who were now uh, trying to find ways of contesting the our incarceration, and so this I knew nothing about. But then there was apparently one uh, person. His name was Kiyoshi Okamoto. Um, Kiyoshi uh, was then an older person, a Nisei, uh, was trying to tell the people that what had happened to us, being put into the camps, was wrong. That the government had uh, basically not followed the Constitution. He called himself, because no one, he was by himself as trying to tell the story. And so he called himself the Fair Play Committee of One. And they began to draft the people out of the camp. Uh, there were different groups now trying to see if to bring about possibly a suit or bring it to court using now the um, a resistance to the draft as a way of ending up in court to test the validity of keeping us, putting us into these camps. There are many groups that, well, I would say that the one group in Hard Mountain uh, had were holding meetings, and they apparently got together with Kiyoshi Okamoto, and then they adopted the title of a Fair Play Committee. And now I guess the people says, well, we are now a Fair Play Committee of many. And with this, they were formed. The group uh, passed out, distributed information as to what the suit or how we're going to contest the drafting, and also use that as a means of getting into court the situation that here were uh, people being held in a uh, incarceration in an internment camp. As the drafting of the men from the camps continued, there were a few of us who then, upon receiving our draft notice, decided that we would not respond to the request. That was really the first step, the physical examination. So I did not respond to that. And while at that time, I was working in the engineering department at the Heart Mountain. People there uh, found out that I had refused to answer the draft call. And then a couple of weeks later, one of the workers approached me and said that they didn't think that it was kind of really not work there, because one of the administrators' son was recently killed in the war. So with that, I quit working. And then I guess a week or so later, um, then this was sometimes after I had refused to answer the draft call, I guess it was the FBI or the local marshals anyway, they came by and picked me up early in the morning, and ended up now in being questioned about my supposed activities, and oh, who I had talked to and so forth. But as it was, I made my decision without talking to anyone, and so basically I was just doing it completely on my own. But then they were apparently, the authorities are apparently trying now to find evidence of who were the members of the Fair Play Committee that were now pushing, uh, and actually in the final statement said that we would now fight the draft as a means of stating getting back our civil rights. At the time that I was arrested, um, it was interesting that my mother handed me a uh, I think, a notebook and a pencil, and I didn't think much about it. But then, as I sat in the county jail with nothing much to do, I then began to write down my different uh, things that was happening to me. And so it ended up that I had a little diary that that I wrote into from the time that I was arrested to the time that we were convicted in Cheyenne about a month or so later. And that particular book is sitting in the archives of the Heart Mountain uh, Center. We apparently, there were 63 of us that were then had refused to answer the draft call, and uh, there was that 63 was a large group that I later heard that there was not enough space in the different county jails in Wyoming, and so someone made the comment that at that time we filled up all the county jails in Wyoming, and I ended up in the county jail in Casper, Wyoming, and from there, um, before the trial began in Cheyenne, Wyoming, uh, we then spent. It was a brand new building and a brand new uh, county jail, and so it was nice and clean. And we were, in fact, the only ones in that county jail in Casper. Well, from there, when before the trial began, we were then transferred to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where it turned out that it was an old building. The jail itself was old, and compared to Casper, it was dirty and it looked like it has never been cleaned. And so there we were, the 63 of us jammed into this uh, jail, and we, in fact, uh, many of us ended up uh, sleeping on the floor because there's not that much room. And I remember after a week or so, some of the people, some of the guys decided, well, because we just really didn't do much of anything, to and asked the guards if we can then have uh, something now that we might be able to clean up the jail. And so we got, I guess, brushes and old rags and soap and water, and we virtually 63 of us scrubbed down that county jail and really cleaned it up. And so it would look much nicer than the time we got there, and it felt much better being cleaned up. So that was one of the activities that we had uh, there in the Cheyenne jail. The trial itself uh, was the judge. Well, we had decided that perhaps we had a choice of whether we're going to have a trial by jury, or we could then forego that and then have a trial under just the judge. And because of the wartime conditions, the group decided that it would probably be uh, more in our favor to forego the trial by jury and then have it with the judge only. Well, that turned out to be a bad joke because later on we found that I guess it's Judge Kennedy was uh, was really a racist, and later on in a book by Dr. Eric Muller, uh, uh, Eric was able to then write about all his racial attitudes, and so in our choice of not having a trial by jury was a bad one. But anyway, we ended up being uh, well. Let me go back a bit. The the trial that we were basing our defense was on the fact that we were now incarcerated in a concentration camp, and uh, so my understanding was that some of the people had information that um, the selective service did not apply to anyone being held in a jail. So that was one of the points that we wanted to bring out, and also the fact that we were placed in a concentration camp itself. But the judge and uh, did not even consider that particular point, and the only consideration was uh, did we or did we not answer our draft call, and so that was the only point that was in contention. So since we did not uh, answer the draft call, yes, then we were guilty. Well, and then sentenced to 3 years in a federal penitentiary. Uh, Later on, I found out that most Caucasian draft resistors would receive sentences about 6 months, a year, and maybe at the most 2 years. Here we received 3 years. The total by law was 5 years and a $10,000 fine. But we were then uh, given a 3 year sentence, which is on the basically on the high side. So I guess the length of the sentence was given to at least um, defer or keep anyone from thinking of not answering the draft calls a little bit to think about at the time. We were then transferred from the Cheyenne, and there were so many of us, there's 63, that our group was then divided by age. So we had an older group, which I think was around, well, about 30 or so of the older people, older men were then sent to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, I believe. And then the rest of us, the younger guys, were sentenced to McNeil Island in in the Puget Sound in the state of Washington. I went by train, and it took us about 2 days to get there. And when we arrived, uh, McNeil Island Penitentiary was on an island, and which was just south of Seattle, Washington, and so we took this boat ride over to the prison, and once there, uh, we were then processed and permitted to be with the rest of the prisoners at the main prison on McNeil Island. While there, I found a sort of a course in mathematics by a Filipino, and he was an engineer, and so he taught this math course. It turned out that I found that I think he was then, for my information, uh, sentenced to life in prison at the time for spying for the Japanese.
Hmm.
But then he then went ahead and had this course that he taught. Well, after about a month or so in the main prison, we were then transferred to what was called a low security farm outside on the island of where McNeil Island. The facilities there was completely without barbed wire, without locked doors, and living there was almost like living in a college dormitory. Transferring out there, I thought, well, I'm going to then not be able to continue my math course with this Filipino uh, prisoner, and find out that, oh, well, he'll do it as a correspondence. And so I continue with my uh, studies with him. And so completed 2 years of math that was virtually on the college level. So that really helped me out later on. But then the more interesting, and I think for me more educationally, was actually meeting and really talking to the other inmates in the prison at the farm on McNeil Island. We had conscientious objectors who were uh, mostly, well, I would say all well educated, and many of them uh, at the university or level or beyond. And then I guess in the conflict with Roosevelt's uh, uh, financial rulings had ended up, they were bankers that ended up in prison. We then had individuals who were, I would say, mostly blacks, who then were uh, 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 people there in prison before for some of the, I would call it as the criminal activities that they had participated in. And then we also had uh, individuals who I guess at that time uh, would be, say, intercepted and trying to cross the border into the United States. And they ended up, uh, and I guess they're mostly Mexicans at that time, ended up in prison. And so we had this huge, wide spread of individuals from the different types, different uh, parts of society. And we also had two Alaskan natives who were then lifers, apparently because of some um, tribal conditions, I'd say. They had to apparently might have had to revenge a wrongdoing, and I guess I never really got to all the information. Were in there for life for apparently uh, killing a person. But these two were some of the nicest people that I've ever met, and so I got to know them very well. But then, oh, I also then befriended many of the prisoners from the black group, and then to find out, one of the first times that I really got uh, close and to what was going on, and they would tell me how uh, at that time in the because we were still in the depression era in the 30s, late 30s, that they said that they would then stand outside these big, at that time, one of the earlier style supermarkets, would have the grand opening, and with the grand opening they would then be passing out free food for the people to try. And they now, as a young black kid standing outside, uh, was wondering whether it would be safe to go into the store, like there was the Piggly Wiggly store at that time, to now partake of the free samples. And so, but yet they would then, I guess, go on in and then and try to see if they can get some free food, uh, being very, and so I got feelings that yeah, these people were really even hurting, going hungry and being cold, and so that made me understand. And even today, I can see that um, these conditions are still in existence. Hopefully, that things will change for the better with what the events of today. One of the fellows in our group was working in the office, and he came across a letter from uh, the director of the camps uh, asking that we the resistors be, be not be released, especially at that 1 year period, because he felt that that was just a slight tap on the wrist. And then I guess they were afraid that more people would then be resisting the drive. And so, uh, so then that was then sent, a request was sent to the director of the federal prison, who in turn now sent letters to the wardens of the camps, of the prisons that we were in. So that was one of the reasons that we did not even heard or even any inkling of a parole hearing at that 1 year or 1/3 of the time, or for us that 1 year period. But it was then for every day that you were a good prisoner, uh, percentage of your sentence would then be reduced. And so most of us were model prisoners. We didn't cause problems, didn't get into fights and so on. Finally, it turned out that around the 2 year time, our good time uh, benefits was such that they had to then, according to this other set of rules, we were then released in July of, I think, 1946, which was almost a year after World War II had ended. Well, we I got back to home, got back home. The family now, very fortunately, with my dad's 3 year lease of the house, was able to get back into the house. My dad then he then ended up buying a rundown nursery. So by the time I got home, the nursery was running, and so I ended up helping out at the nursery. That following September, I started my restarted my education. Well, from LACC, uh, went on and transferred to UCLA, and at and then at UCLA, I got my bachelor's, and then I was working toward my master's degree when I got my second draft notice. And um, then here we were. I thought, well, we had stated in our resistance in camp that if we would release families, let the families go home, and then give us our civil rights back, that we would gladly serve um, in the army. President Truman had then pardoned all the draft resistors, so we were now had our citizenship back, which then made us eligible for the draft. And so everything that we had requested as a protest while we were in camp has now been, in a way, uh, answered. And so I then ended up being drafted, going into the army in I think June of 1953. The Korean War was still on. Very fortunately for me, during the my basic training period, the ceasefire was agreed upon. And so at least then I was spared the possibility of a part of a shooting war. I was then getting a degree in botanical sciences, and also it turned out that within the group in the botany department at UCLA, there was a group now, and one of the big things at that time was uh, beginning of the plant hormones. We had one hormone called indolacetic acid, which was still being used today, which then uh, would hasten the formation of roots. And so, but also at that time, not only after the Korean War, we then had the Vietnam War, in which those particular defoliants were then used to cause the leaves of the trees to fall off so they could see the enemy down below hiding among the vegetation. Well, that the group in UCLA was working with, at that time, 1953, with the place called Camp Dietrich, which was in Frederick, Maryland, and it was the Center for the Chemical and Biological Warfare Center. And so and I sort of reminisce back and says, yeah, here in 1943, 44, I was considered as a 4C enemy alien. And then now in 1953, some 10 years later, I was then eligible as a participant in a top secret military installation. I says, wow, he says, what would have changed that had occurred in those 10 years? Well, it turned out that while I was assigned to Camp Dietrich, I had a grad student friend, Wally Ernst, who was also drafted at the same time. And I guess both of us were destined for Camp Dietrich, but then he ended up in Germany, and then I ended up transferring out to a station hospital in Texas, in Fort Hood, Texas. So anyway, it was kind of interesting as to see what had transpired. And then after my time in the service, as I was uh, being discharged, I heard the talk of a GI Bill. And so I said, Sarge, I said, what's this GI Bill? I thought that was just World War II. And he says, no, GI Bill is still good for the Korean vets. And I says, oh, so that meant as a GI Bill, 4 years of college help. Talked it over with my wife. I was then married and already had one child. That I would then go back to UCLA and take advantage of the GI Bill and and hopefully now work for my PhD, and which then did work out. So I ended up now from the Army 4 years later or 5 years later, with the help of the GI Bill, with a PhD degree in my hand, and this in turn now opened up quite a large area for me. And at the time that I had graduated with my doctorate degree, the space program was going full blast. I ended up in the space biology laboratory at UCLA. And then from there, I ended up in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, from which I retired. And I retired, let's see, I think in 1989 or something like that. I'll sort of conclude my talk. I don't know of adding any more relative to the resistors story.
Thank you so much, Sam and Takashi, for sharing those stories with us. I know we'll have some questions from folks who are following along the live stream, but just to get us started, I have a question for each of you. So Sam, first, now you are a national speaker. You travel all over the place telling these stories and talking about your experience and your family's experience of being incarcerated. What made you want to start traveling and telling these stories? And what have you learned from telling this story to so many people around the country?
Well, to answer the question, I really began when I got a call back in year roughly about 2011, about 9 years ago. I got a call from Heart Mountain. The executive director at that time asked if I can speak because there was a convention, and the organizers was asking, is there a former prisoner who can give a talk about what happened? And so that's how I began. And I had retired from Boeing. And now I had time. I wanted to do something unusual and different. And I thought, well, not too many of us can talk about what happened because a lot of people have either died or they're very senior in age. So as a result, that's how I began. And I've been all over the country and I thoroughly enjoy it. And that's what motivates me to help educate people who really don't know much about what happened and why it happened. And of course, always trying to conclude on, could it happen to other people? And very, very satisfying experience having to do that.
Yeah, and did you have to do a lot of research when your talk has so much history in it and so many details about your family, but also about what was going on outside of your own experience? Did you do a lot of research to put together this presentation?
Well, the personal aspects, what I remember, that was easy. I just, I can't forget so many events that happened during camp, but what was relatively new to me was a lot of the legal steps that were taken. I really hadn't heard about Korematsu back in 2011, and I hadn't heard about a lot of the major events that happened along the way, and so yeah, I had to do some homework. One of my challenges was to speak at a lawyers' conference, which was interesting because I like to start my talks with a question: how many of you have heard about these camps? And then the second question is, how many of you heard about Fred Korematsu? And to my surprise, on that first conference of lawyers, about 92% had never heard of Fred Korematsu.
Wow.
That was almost shocking. And so I thought to myself, well, this is easy. they know a lot less than I do, which isn't much, but that's okay. And that's how I began. And I had to fill in, certain things that I really didn't know much about. But I think it all dovetailed together. It worked out okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Takashi, you talk a lot about being a resistor and your experience leaving camp. Can you tell us more about your response to the loyalty questionnaire and maybe how you felt when you first read those questions and how you responded to questions 27 and 28?
Yeah, well, I like question 27 and 28 out of the 30. 27 had to do with rescinding your loyalty or to the Emperor of Japan, and that was not much of a problem there. And I says, no, yeah, certainly I would forego that. But then coming to, I think, 28, there that asked whether I would be willing to serve in the Army and be sent in any place. But the thing that a little puzzled me was that now if I answered a yes to that, would I be volunteering for the Army? And so I decided, well, not to be on the safe side, I answered no, that I would not be willing to serve wherever they would send me. And so then I guess in the question answering was a no yes, so I became a no yes boy, which think many people only think of being a yes, yes, or a no, no. So they end up, then I had to point out to the people that no, because they had referred to the resistors out of Heart Mountain as the no boys. And they said, no, I think that's incorrect. They may have to look at each individual's response to question 27 and 28.
Right. And you said you didn't talk about this decision with anyone, but did you explain to your family afterwards, when you were, not going to your physical or when you were getting arrested? Did you explain to them your thoughts, or did they just accept what you had done?
Yeah, they didn't talk about it even after, even from the time that I did not report until the time they picked me up. No, and even after coming back home, that never. I guess we were just too busy recouping, and so we never even really sat down and talked about what had happened. So I think in some cases, I think the family might be surprised to hear the story of what had happened to me in those periods. Yeah.
And you talk about the notepad that your mom gave you, Takashi. Have you read that since? I know it's in the Heart Mountain archives now, but did you read it? Have you read it in the recent years?
Not recently. Several years ago, and I can't pinpoint how long ago it was. We had Paul Tsuneishi and Frank Chin were at the time very active doing interviews and so forth. So at that time, they had asked about what I had done, and I mentioned about doing writing having this little notebook and writing into it, and I don't remember all what had happened, but eventually what happened was I had to turn around and see where is that notebook. I did find it, and so Paul Tsuneishi then took that notebook and made photocopies of each page, and then he actually then had it all typed out. And so we now have the typed out version and plus a photocopy, and then the book itself. And eventually, well, then I turned it over, and it's now sitting in the archive at Heart Mountain. And so it's the thing is that I'm not much of a writer even today, and so what did I mostly write about? It was, well, we had this terrible food for dinner and so on, and that this is basically about what I put in, and I was sort of envious of one of the other resistors, and who could really write well, and so I always defer back to the other members. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but it's good to have those details still, though, of what you did, those little stories. That's great. Sam, I have a question for you from Victor Yamada, who says, Sam, were family relatives in other prison camps, and were you able to communicate them the way that other people who were incarcerated in Lordsburg, New Mexico were able to communicate?
Yes, and by the way, I know I know that well, it's frequently asked about the communications between the family members and were we broken up, and the answer is yes. Our family was broken up into two camps. On my mother's side, I had two aunts, and my grandparents on my mother's side went to Topaz, and the rest of us went to Heart Mountain, and we could not figure out why they split us up, because we lived about a block from each other in San Francisco, and so to this day I have no understanding as to how they divided the people up. Regardless, that's what happened, and we were able to communicate fairly well. In fact, because of my grandparents' failing health in Topaz, my two aunts were allowed to come and visit Heart Mountain because they had heard that Heart Mountain has a better hospital facility than they have in Topaz. And so they wanted to do some research to find out if it's worth it to try to get the grandparents to move into Heart Mountain. Anyway, that did not happen, but regardless, we were able to communicate, and that went along well. And on the item about did we have anyone at, for example, in Lordsburg, New Mexico? And the answer is yes. On my in-law side, I had a fellow who was at Lordsburg, and my understanding is yes, we were allowed to communicate by way of letters. And so that was, in fact, communication was not a problem at all of the camps. And we would be able to read newspapers and write letters. So that was really not a big problem at all.
That's good. Thank you. Thanks, Sam. And Takashi, we have a question for you from Ken Mochizuki, who says, Takashi, how were you treated by your Japanese American community when you returned home as a draft resistor, in particular by the vets?
Well, turned out that I didn't talk much about my prison experience or anything. And so many of the friends that I made going back to school knew virtually nothing about my past. And so I did, in a way, I just kept quiet about the thing. And it was many years later that I eventually began to talk more about or certain things that come up. And I would say, yeah, well, in answering a specific question, I might say that, yes, well, I was a draft resistor, or the fact that at one time I said, well, I think I broke parole because I went off skiing outside of LA County. And so these are, but very little. And it's only been in the last maybe 10 years or so that people ask questions and people have asked me to talk about my experience, But then after I left the prison, I kept in touch with the conscientious objectors, and so those that I had met at McNeil, we became fast friends. And then one of the individuals was Gordon Hirabashi, who spent a few months at McNeil Island. And so I got a chance to meet him. And then even after we were out, because of certain events that we would then get together and find out, oh, yeah, while you were at McNeil. And I think in the last couple of years, so I ran into a fellow that I remember the name, but I didn't quite, years had passed, so it was kind of hard to recognize it. So, yeah. So anyway, so that's some of the things that has happened relative to eventually telling my story.
And Takashi, when you met your wife or when you were getting married, did you tell her this story about your past as a draft resistor, or?
No, the only time I think I told her was about the time I decided that I would ask her to marry me. So then, in fact, I was quite shocked at times when other people had found out what I did. They were enthralled. I said, oh yeah, And I said, well, it was so anyway, yeah. So I met Barbara. Well, soon after coming back, I started at LACC the following September, and then it was in that and then I was basically, thinking of being an engineer, but with what had happened during the war, and then plus the fact that it would probably be difficult for me to get an engineering job with the background as a prison record.
Mhm.
So then when my dad was running the nursery business, so I said, okay, I'll learn more about plants so we can help out there. So I started the courses in botany, and in that freshman botany class, it was this gal that I saw, and I said, oh, find kind of be interesting to meet her. Eventually, I did, and I guess I guess slow. But anyway, after 6 years of meeting her off and on and courting her, uh, then I finally, when I asked her, I told her, well, I told her that what my background and whether that she would be accepting me or not. And she says, oh, yeah, that's fine. So, yeah. So we have uh, two children, and she passed away about in 2012, which is about 8 years ago. So we had a very nice, long, happy marriage. But very quickly about her, she she was one of the world experts on the fern plants, and so we got to travel all over the world as she did her research and also giving talks. And so, anyway, I think I made a pretty good choice. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. Oh, that's awesome. And Sam, it's heartbreaking to hear you talk about all of the health issues that your family endured while they were at Heart Mountain. And I'm wondering if that experience shapes the way that you tell the story of incarceration, or your experience with incarceration, or shapes the way that you remember that time in your life and have lived then as an adult.
Well, what I try to impress on my audience is, the fact that you have a physical facility like a prison camp, and you're given food and room and board. That doesn't mean you're being treated in a humane manner. If you don't get the quality of medical care that's reasonable in this day and age, or at that time in 1945 even, that is inhumane. And so it's not only unconstitutional, but treating captive people who deserve to be treated humanely is very important. So that's a kind of a message I like to leave in my talks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you both so much. I want to ask just one more question of both of you before we wrap up, which is thinking about, the wonderful messages that are in your talks and the answers you've given to my questions today. What kind of advice or words of wisdom do you have to pass on to young people today, especially in light of the protests that are going on right now and the fact that we're all isolating because of COVID-19? What kinds of words can you offer to young people today, or any people today, I guess?
Well, I think I could kick that off with an observation I've had in my talks. I frequently get to high school students, and a typical question is, what can I do? I'm only a high school student. And I would reply back, you can do a lot. You have no idea of the power that you have. When it comes time to vote, you can certainly do the right research and make sure you're voting for the person you really believe will be the right leader of this country. But even before that, if you're not old enough to vote, you can certainly speak up and be heard. And if you find that something is not going well and not going right, speak up. Let people know. Let others know. That this is a very, very important event that's going on, and people need to be educated as to what's right and what's wrong. It's very, very important.
Thanks, Sam.
Well, one of the things that I always like to point out is, and in my case, when I was 16 years old, I knew very little about what was really going on. And I think even today, I think that the younger people, it's very difficult for them to really pay attention or to spend time really looking at or trying to understand what is really going on. And so, if possible, I'd say, yeah, look at the news and then think more about what is happening in the world. And as you build up your information basis, I think that you can probably or most likely make correct decisions as you go along in life.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you both so much, and thank you for sharing your stories with us and your afternoon. And thanks everyone who joined via YouTube. We're so grateful for your questions and your participation, and we'll see you soon. But thank you so much, Sam and
Thank you.
Takashi.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
You, thank,
Thank you much.
thank,